Well, there are two sets of issues of importance here. Firstly, how has foreign policy changed in general, and how is foreign policy changing the nature of governance in the European Union? The second question is, how does the Westphalian system of international relations thereby become challenged and changed? So first of all, foreign policy. I think the big question is, who are the diplomats now? We all think we know what a diplomat is. Basically, it's someone working for a foreign ministry, defending outside his country the interests of his country abroad. And usually diplomats of that kind work for ministries of foreign affairs. But for a long time now, the foreign policy in the European Union isn't only that, because all of the work that diplomats do within the European Union is actually done, or I say all, I mean most of the work is actually done not by diplomats who work for foreign ministries, but by the international departments of domestic ministries, what we call in English the lead ministries. So therefore, if you're a Ministry of Trade or if you're a Ministry of Environment, your international department does the work of a diplomat within the European Union. The Council working group you go to is full of people from like ministries in other countries. It's not full of Foreign Office diplomats. So that's changed something. The diplomats now are not only the Ministry of Foreign Affairs staff. They deal basically with the external ramifications of domestic policies. But that's important, because what it means is that a lot of what was foreign policy 60, 70 years ago is now, in fact, international implications of domestic policy. So it was the intellectual property, if you like, of domestic departments, and they're the international divisions of those domestic departments. So gradually these people began to get the skills they needed, the negotiation techniques, they grew bigger, and they became as good as diplomats. They spoke the languages too. They were specialists, whereas the diplomats were generalists. So what role was there left for diplomats? Well, a lot of people said, well, the role of the diplomat is to look at the overall picture, to look at the general interest in the European Union. Because after all, if they're not specialists, the diplomats from the Foreign Office can't correct the views of the specialized departments. The problem was that if the diplomats were now going to be a kind of gatekeeper for foreign policy, and to make sure that an environmental specialist didn't do something that was actually not in the general interest of the country, in my case the British, somehow the foreign ministry would have to be in a kind of controlling or supervising role of the other ministries. And the ministries, they didn't like that, of course. So in addition to that Foreign Office role now as the gatekeeper of the international aspects of domestic policy, what you find is that because the Foreign Ministry was considered by all the other ministries as yet another ministry, why should they be the leaders? You find a growth in Europe of the European departments of prime ministerial offices. So more and more, we call it in English the Cabinet Office. There are different names in other countries. More and more, you've got prime ministerial offices who did the coordination between the domestic departments, of which the Foreign Office was only one. So that's a first very different kind of governance. So there was a challenge really then for power in terms of who's responsible for foreign ministries. And a lot of people said, well, you can actually close down your Foreign Office department dealing with Europe, because after all, if the domestic departments are doing the job, we don't need diplomats. In the meantime, there of course was another challenge to diplomacy within the European Union. Remember, 28 states, quite a large number of states. Look at it as a percentage of the members of the United Nations. 28 out of 192 members is quite a large portion. So this other challenge was from finance ministries. How much money, they said, are we spending on your important and very well-equipped embassies in all the countries? If you look at the British Embassy in Paris, it's a luxury building, it's very beautiful and it costs a lot of money. To keep an official in an embassy abroad also costs a lot of money. They get special conditions, they're quite highly paid, you have to rent a house for them and so on. They're expensive staff. So a lot of people said, no, you've got to be like all the other domestic ministries. When we have cuts, you've got to be one of the ministries that looks for cuts and decides that they can do the same with fewer resources. So that's a challenge to the diplomats. They would have less money to spend, and people would be saying, are you really necessary at all? Maybe you're necessary in the big countries, but you're not really necessary in the smaller countries throughout the European Union. In particular, it was so easy for someone from the Ministry of the Environment to get a plane in the morning and fly to Brussels, do the work and fly home. You didn't need someone to live in Brussels. You could do all the work from your national capital. It was difficult if you were Greek, because it's quite a long trip, but okay, it was still cheaper than having someone there permanently. So this is a European problem, but it's not only a European problem, because if you look at the foreign ministries of the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, they all have the same issues, because there is what we call the CNN effect. The fact that journalists get the information that diplomats would have formerly got to prime ministers and to cabinets worldwide. Basically, the CNN gets there first, and in fact they have an insider view that diplomats often find difficult to achieve. And the other thing was that with the pressure of foreign ministries, it was said, well, you don't really need an ambassador in every country. We can have one ambassador for a few countries. It's what's called a hub and spoke system. So you can have an embassy in, say, Kenya that would be responsible for 5 or 6 East African countries. Many countries in the world, Canada's a good example because they've done this a lot, thought, well, we'll have hub and spoke systems in order to save money. So this is not only a European phenomenon, but the Europeans suffer from that phenomenon as well.